Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Merissa Khurma, who is Program Director of the Wilson Center's Middle East Program and is an editor and contributor to Enheduanna, a blog of the Middle East Women's Initiative, and Haleh Esfandiari. Haleh is a distinguished fellow with the Wilson Center's Middle East Program and is also Director Emerita. Haleh and Merissa, welcome. Great to see both of you.
Thank you, John.
Great to see you.
So we're going to discuss today a special series of blog posts that you released on International Women's Day, and we're doing so during Women's History Month. And Merissa, let's begin by telling our viewers about the blog. I know you and I have discussed it on this program before, but just in case we're catching anyone up, could you tell us about the blog and what its goal is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. So Enheduanna is a blog that we launched about 3 years ago now. And the goal is really to get as many women's voices from the Middle East and North Africa region as possible featured in the blog. So we always invite women who are working not solely on women's issues, but women diplomats, women public officials, ministers, as well as women leading NGOs in civil society, the grassroots level, women entrepreneurs. So we get a variety of perspectives and we give them a platform to basically talk about the work that they do and describe the challenges that they face as women in the various domains and fields that they work in, but also highlight the successes that they have championed through that tireless work that they do in the region.
And tell us about this specific cluster of stories that you released on International Women's Day.
So we released 8 blogs on March 8th, of course, to commemorate International Women's Day, as you noted. But this year in particular, we wanted all the writers to highlight what role the United States can actually do to help advance their efforts on the ground in their respective countries to advance women's rights and improve their situation, whether on the political front, on the economic front, or the sociocultural front. And this is important because the Biden-Harris White House has set up the Gender Policy Council that is focused on both domestic and foreign policy. And so I think it was a very good sort of repository of ideas coming in from women of the region or the diaspora, highlighting what are the main concerns, what are the main issues in the countries that we featured, Algeria, Egypt, Bahrain, Morocco, Iran, Israel, and Yemen. And so those are, of course, just a handful of countries represented, but it's important for this council to listen to the voices of women from the region and connect to them and with them as their foreign gender policy is being charted out.
But one of the pieces and one of the authors is with us, Haleh Esfandiari. And Haleh, the title of your blog post certainly is completely compatible with Merissa's description of the overall goal. Listen to women activists in Iran. What did you write about, Haleh, and what is the message?
John, all along, I have believed that the change comes from within Iran. You have interviewed me in the past a number of times about Iran. And, we have talked about the various aspects, because I think in the last 42 years, since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, really the only group that has stood up to the regime has been women on the ground. And, activist women, followed by quite a substantial number of younger women. You're dealing with a country where half the population is under the age of 40. And, the majority of entering classes at universities are women. I mean, the situation became so worrisome for the Islamic Republic. They were discussing, introducing a quota in favor of men. All our lives, I mean, we have been, pushing for quotas for women. Now suddenly there is the Islamic Republic who wants to do the opposite, quotas for men. Therefore, you have a nucleus, you have a group of active women on the ground who didn't leave the country, who stayed there. People, I can give you names, lawyers, women activists, even women in business who are doing quite well, university professors and so on. So I think the council, what my argument was, council, please listen to the voices that come from the region and talk to the women in the diaspora, but you should be guided by the women in the region. And this is the argument, John, I use for other countries, because look, there are countries where there is a tension between the United States and that country, like Iran. So we don't want the United States to take the initiative, because what is going to happen is that these women, it will hurt the women on the ground. But if the women want to, they can always turn to the United States and say, and they're very bold. I'm talking about the Iranian. They say, help us talk about these issues, talk about human rights violation, talk about torture, talk about executions,
Are we, the fact that we're asking people to listen suggests that they're not. And so I want to ask, is the situation improving? Are people listening more? And who are we talking about? Who needs to be doing the listening? And I'd like both of you to comment on that, if you would.
I think that there always has been channels of communication with people on the ground, but often those who are doing more of this tireless work at the grassroots level are not the ones at the forefront or as part of this communication, because it's usually government to government. There are a few NGOs that are often invited or engaged in conferences and in dialogue, and in fact receive some funding from the United States Agency for International Development, for example, or from the Department of State. But there are so many more actors, and as Haleh once called them, the agents of change, who should also be listened to. So it's not that there hasn't been any listening. It's just a friendly reminder that those are the people, as Haleh noted, who know the issues really well. They understand how the issues should be framed, and in many cases they need support because there's a lot of pushback against their efforts, given that they're trying to change laws and in most cases social mindsets, and that is very, very difficult.
Haleh, I wonder, Merissa mentions that there's often government to government communication, but then maybe not so much when you get below those official channels. Are there effective forums, or are there effective ways for something like the Gender Policy Council to engage at different levels and to listen?
John, the World Bank and the IMF are very influential because they hold the purse. And let's say, just to give you a recent example, the Iranian government applied, I think, to the IMF for $5 billion to help them to fight corona, the virus, My suggestion would be that they used to do it, but I don't know whether they are doing it now or not, is that always make a point that some of that money goes to women NGOs on the ground or programs that women are leading, you see? Because just to give you the example of the coronavirus, more women than men have lost their employment since the virus started in Iran. They are staggering figures of women who lost their employment. If the IMF is going to help, or if the World Bank is going to help, or if any of the EU countries are going to help, they should insist that some part of that money should go to the women's issues and women's activities, but not hand it to the Iranian government and say, you distribute it. No, the World Bank has an office in Iran. All the EU countries have embassies in Iran. They can do the supervision.
You know, Merissa, Haleh brings up the pandemic, and the conventional wisdom around the globe, not just in the Middle East, is that women already up against it are even more burdened and even disproportionately affected by the coronavirus and all of the fallout from that, both socially, economically, and otherwise. How much ground has been lost?
Well, in the Middle East, it's akin to figures in Iran or the data emerging from Iran. More women have lost jobs than men because many countries enacted very strict lockdowns that also forced members of the same family to be confined together under very stressful conditions, very difficult economic conditions. And so that sort of also resulted in a surge in gender-based violence, because in most cases, unfortunately, the abusers are either the male husbands, brothers, or fathers, and so we've seen an uptick. And of course, the pressure of the pandemic and the taxing economic conditions have contributed further to that. And so that's what we're talking about in the Middle East. But the United States has seen a similar trend where more jobs were lost by women than men, and particularly when the childcare services and schools have also been affected. This has added even more to women's plates, and particularly working moms. And so the pressures are the same, and that's why it's important, as this Gender Policy Council, which I think is an excellent vehicle to mainstream all the policies from a gender perspective, has to be cognizant that in order to be effective abroad in supporting others, many of these challenges also have to be addressed here at home, because we've seen similar experiences, whether you are in New York City, Washington, D.C., or in Amman, Jordan, where I was born and raised, or Cairo, Cairo, Egypt. So I think that's one of the most important points that was also raised by many of our contributors.
Haleh, I'm wondering if I'm maybe fishing for a silver lining, but do you think it's possible, should we have any optimism around the notion that what the pandemic has exposed is that anyone who is in denial about the plight of women in many countries around the world can no longer deny it because it's been laid bare? Do you take any hope that this could possibly end up being a catalyst for reform?
It really, John, depends which country we are talking about. I mean, when you talk about the MENA region, look, they are starting vaccinating now people, but I bet you anything, the men take precedence over women. Why? Because the attitude is that the man is the breadwinner in the family. So if you want to give that vaccine, first give the vaccine to the man. But unlike, I think, the United States and even in some European countries where there are people who deny the effectiveness of the vaccine, my sense, at least about Iran is, and Merissa can talk about Jordan and the rest of the countries, is that there is an eagerness to get the vaccine, and among women especially, because they look after the family. They want the vaccine to be able to go back to work, to send their children to work. Really, the pandemic has played havoc with the region, with families. Lockdown or no lockdown, Merissa knows. I mean, who cares about the lockdown? Try and put people in it's something, occasionally you see people wearing a mask, especially when they see a TV camera, of course they'll wear a mask. But no, so I just think that the more we talk about the vaccine, and if the United States decides to send vaccines in these countries in the Middle East, they should make a point of saying half of it goes to women, the other half goes to men. And that is very important. In Iran, they have started making their own vaccine, and they talk about probably having it within the next month or so. And having talked to people, they say they basically, because the supreme leader has forbidden the import of Pfizer and Moderna and any European and Iranian and American vaccine. So they are waiting for the local vaccine, but they have imported the Sputnik from Russia, and some people are taking it, some people are hesitant. So this is the...
Merissa, when you look around the MENA region, are there footholds for progress? Are there any best practices or better situations you could point to that might light the way to reforms that would be transformative?
Absolutely. And I am very hopeful precisely because these exceptions, these sort of rays of light are not confined to one place. You see them in conflict zones such as Libya and Syria and Yemen. In Yemen, we've featured a few authors who, despite the ravages of war that their country has seen, have been able to organize. And that's key. Women's role in those local communities is key in getting people together, in maintaining and securing children particularly, and also tending to the internally displaced, for example. So yes, I do see lots of best practices. I think when women get together and they mobilize and they organize around a cause, and they're able to, for the lack of a better term, sort of face off with the authorities on that particular issue, I think they can be very successful, particularly during the pandemic, and precisely because they're largely absent from these crisis management committees that have been formed. We see very few women on these COVID committees that have made policies without women's voices. And so you saw an uproar by women's groups saying, hello, you need to speak to us because women are being affected, they're impacted negatively, you need to have women at the table. And so we've seen some really good stories. Lilia Labidi from Tunisia talks about how women scientists have now been featured on TV, and women university professors who are the vast majority now in Tunisian academia, because so many men have migrated to Europe. So they remained in Tunisia, and the pandemic gave them an opportunity to be highlighted. And so she was calling, for example, for science diplomacy, highlighting women scientists and doctors between the United States and Tunisia. So those are the women, those are the stories that give me a lot of hope. And women do not have to be, in the highest positions in government to make change. They are exercising leadership at all levels. And that is what gives me hope.
Well, that's a terrific positive note to end on, but I'm going to tempt fate and see. Haleh, is there anything else you want to add?
I have been working on this issue all my adult life, and I am very hopeful because I believe in the younger generation. But the reality on the ground is slightly different. Merissa mentioned Lilia, and when I read her piece, John, Lilia, you
Yes.
must have interviewed her when she was at the center. When I read her piece, my take was that, look, the men have the possibility to emigrate, but the women are left behind. So I think there is two sides. to everything. But I'm hopeful. I trust this younger generation. And by the way, some people have nominated an Iranian woman and a Saudi woman to be for the Nobel Peace Prize. Narges Mohammadi and the Saudi woman. So let's cross our fingers.
That's right. Well, you know, none of this is preordained, right? And people have to keep at it. And thanks to both of you for your leadership and your ongoing efforts, because that's the only way we're going to make progress, correct?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
Again. And to those of you who'd like to read more of Enheduanna and come to the Wilson Center website, look under the Middle East program, not just the releases during Women's History Month for International Women's Day, but there's constantly new content being produced by some of the contributors we talked about today, including Haleh and Merissa. So thanks again for joining us, and to our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.